On day two of America's 250th anniversary fair, the organizers shut the whole thing down early. Their official reason? Rain. Here's the thing. A lot of people who are actually there don't think rain is the real story. And once you start pulling on this thread, you find a Confederate flag controversy, a half-empty National Mall, and two completely different versions of what happened that same night, depending on which channel you were watching. Welcome back to the channel. Every day we take one story out of Washington and break it down properly. Today we're going deep on one, the Great American State Fair, Trump's 16-day national mall-spanning celebration of the country's 250th birthday. This is a longer one because there's a lot more here than a rainy night. Stick with me through all of it. Segment 1, the timeline. Let's start with what actually happened in order. The fair opened Wednesday, June 24th, with a kickoff rally headlined by Trump himself, after multiple musical acts had already pulled out. By Friday, the 26th, only day two, organizers posted that both the fair and the adjacent World Cup fan zone were closing early, citing storms, with plans to reopen Saturday morning at 10 a.m. That part is genuinely true. There really were storms rolling through D.C. that evening. A planned I Love the 90s concert featuring Vanilla Ice got pulled with less than 2 hours' notice. One festival staffer told a reporter on the scene simply that they weren't reopening until the next day. For what it's worth, Vanilla Ice himself seemed unbothered by the politics around any of this. Asked about performing at a Trump-branded event, he basically shrugged it off, saying he doesn't even vote, so he doesn't really care who's hosting, and that he'd play for pretty much anyone who asked. Fans are fans. But here's what was already true before a single raindrop fell. Multiple performers, Martina McBride, Bret Michaels, the Commodores, Morris Day and The Time, Young MC, had already backed out of this festival entirely, citing concerns that it had become too politically charged, and at least 10 state governments officially declined to participate with state funds or staff: Oregon, Washington State, Massachusetts, Maine, Vermont, Illinois, North Carolina, Connecticut, and Hawaii, among others. So when people online pushed back on "it was the rain," pointing out that the fair looked sparsely attended well before the storm, that skepticism didn't come from nowhere. Several journalists who showed up in person, independently of each other, described a noticeably thin crowd on opening days, even during dry hours. Segment 2. Who's actually running this? Now, to understand why all of this matters beyond one rained-out evening, you have to understand what this fair actually is and who's behind it. This isn't a Smithsonian production or a nonpartisan national commemoration. It's run by a task force with Trump as chairperson and J.D. Vance as vice chairperson, and it's part of a broader pattern of similar events this year. The same circle organized an Ultimate Fighting Championship event staged on the White House South Lawn for Trump's birthday. They're behind the Salute to America fireworks show. They're behind something called the Patriot Games, a student athletic competition. This fair, 16 days, 56 states and territories, more than 150 exhibits, a restored 1947 carousel, a 110-foot Ferris wheel, is the biggest production in that lineup. The fair's own promotional language describes a nation united in purpose, celebrating the ingenuity, perseverance, and pride that define America. That's a nice pitch, but it glosses over the actual mechanics of how this event gets built. When a state government opts out, as 10 of them did, organizers don't leave that state's pavilion empty. They hand it to private sponsors, companies, and civic groups instead, while still calling it North Carolina's booth or Oregon's booth. That detail might sound like a footnote. It is not. It's exactly the mechanism behind the most damaging story to come out of this fair so far. Segment 3. The Confederate Flag Pavilion.
Because North Carolina officially declined to participate, its pavilion at the fair ended up being run by outside sponsors rather than the state government. And it was at that privately run North Carolina booth that Confederate flag imagery showed up on display, at a federal event explicitly built to represent all 56 states and territories standing together. North Carolina's own governor publicly condemned it. A spokesperson for the booth said the flags weren't approved and were taken down once discovered, framing it as an isolated incident that slipped through. Maybe that's a fair characterization of how it happened in the moment, but step back and look at the structural problem here. Nobody elected, nobody officially accountable to the state of North Carolina was actually running that space. The moment a state government steps back because an event feels too politicized, you create exactly the kind of vacuum where something like this can happen, and then there's no clean chain of accountability when it does. A private group put up the flags, a private spokesperson cleaned it up afterwards. The states whose name was on the booth had no hand in either decision. That's not a weather problem, and it's really not even a few bad actors problem. It's what happens structurally when you build a national celebration designed to need every state's buy-in, and then roughly a fifth of state governments decide not to give it. Transition. Set the controversy aside for a second. What was it actually like to just show up and walk around? Not great, according to multiple independent accounts. A D.C. City Council member posted that visitors shouldn't expect a real state fair experience. No funnel cake, no corn dogs, no bucket lemonade, no fried Snickers, and noted the Ferris wheel, one of the few actual rides, kept breaking down. A reporter for a local outlet who walked through opening weekend described it even starker. She said she walked straight into the festival's most hyped attraction with literally no line, and described feeling like she'd been dropped alone into a half-built video game level. Several state booths, she wrote, turned out to be plywood structures with printed columns stapled to the side, rather than anything resembling a real exhibit hall. The food hall, when she got there, had power outages on and off throughout the day, which meant melted ice cream and food that had been sitting out far too long in the heat. If that sounds familiar, it should. It's basically the same maintenance story we've already covered with the Lincoln Memorial Reflecting Pool, a few hundred yards away, where a freshly renovated, multi-million-dollar feature has been dealing with algae blooms and peeling material since almost the moment it reopened. Two flagship features of the same 250th anniversary season, both struggling with basic upkeep within days of their big unveiling. To be fair, not every account was negative, and not every day was like this. Programming days built around farmers, ranchers, and military families reportedly drew warmer, more engaged crowds, with attendees genuinely moved by the tributes to agriculture and service members. This is a 16-day event. One rough stretch on day 2 doesn't define the whole run, but it does tell you something about the gap between the version of this fair that gets promoted and the version that shows up when ordinary people actually walk the grounds. And that gap becomes almost comically obvious when you compare how different outlets covered the exact same evening. Fox News' coverage that night framed the story almost entirely around bad luck. Mother Nature had other plans, reporters said, treating the rainout simply as an unfortunate twist on an otherwise heartwarming celebration of farmers and ranchers. Their on-the-ground segment focused on flyovers, the Marine Band, and attendees talking about the importance of honoring agriculture. Genuinely positive moments, by the way. For the people who did show up early in the day, by several accounts, the programming was sincere and well received. Meanwhile, independent local reporters covering the same hours described intermittent power outages, broken rides, and empty pavilions, entirely separate from the storm that hit that evening. Both of these things can be true at once. A meaningful tribute to farmers happened. So did real maintenance failures and thin crowds. The disagreement isn't really about facts. It's about which facts get included in the story you choose to tell. And depending on which channel you watched, you'd have walked away with a completely different picture of how this event is actually going. Synthesis. So here's the thread connecting all of this. A fair that needed every state pulling together for America's 250th year instead has roughly a fifth of state governments sitting it out. The vacuum left by one of those states gets filled by a private sponsor, and Confederate flags end up on display with nobody officially accountable. Reporters on the ground describe broken rides and empty food halls, while one major network's coverage of the same night barely mentions any of it. And underneath all of it, a second high-profile National Mall feature, the Lincoln Memorial Reflecting Pool, is dealing with the same kind of upkeep problems as the fair itself. None of this means the whole 250th celebration is doomed. There are still 10 more days on the calendar, themed programming with real turnout potential, and the July 4th finale still ahead. But this week is a pretty clean example of the pattern we keep finding whenever we look closely at one of these flagship events this year. There's the version being sold, and there's the version actually happening on the ground, and the gap keeps showing up in the same places: rained-out evenings, broken Ferris wheels, and pavilions nobody official is actually watching. If you want to see whether the back half of this fair turns it around, or whether July 4th has the same problems, make sure you're subscribed because we'll keep tracking it as it develops. Drop a comment. Do you think this